So I have a question for folk. I'm not just thirsty here. When you look at this glass and it is water, would you say it was half empty or half full? I know many of us would have our own particular answer to that question. It's not a trick question. It's a thought-provoking question. We grew up with my grandmother as a very vital part of our family. I can't remember an occasion until her death that she wasn't around our house. There was always great excitement as her grandchildren when she came to visit, because she would unzip her leather blue suitcase, and the top layer, when she opened the flap, was all bags of candy. She was a great grandma. Lived to be, died, I guess, in her 95th year. And one of the other strong memories for all of us grandkids was that when we were gathered at Christmas time, of course, Grandma would be either at our home or my aunt's house, and we'd all be gathered together. And I think the last present would be opened, and the last little bit of paper was being collected into the garbage bag, and then inevitably my grandmother would clasp her hands together and say, "Well, that's Christmas done for another year." And there'd be this chorus of downhearted grandchildren going, "Grandma!" Like we hadn't even had breakfast yet. But when that last gift was opened, that was always the phrase. And now, even though my grandmother's long gone, whenever the last present is opened, we always hear, "Do you remember when Grandma used to say," or one of us will pipe up and say those words. So she got perhaps what I would consider an unfair sort of nickname as the little black cloud in our family. And so often she would make a comment or a statement, and it would always be responded with this chorus of, "Grandma, like, why do you say things like that? Why do you think that way? Why is the glass always half empty for you?" Our little black cloud. Which is surprising for me, because she was a woman of great faith. She read her Bible faithfully every single day of her life. I can't ever remember a time when I didn't see that Bible on her nightstand or on her coffee table, or in her later years on her TV tray in front of her lazy boy. And it was, being the youngest granddaughter, I was usually the one that got to sleep with Grandma at the cottage or when she came to visit. So lying in bed next to her, she'd always read a passage from the Bible, or she'd be reciting her prayers when we were being tucked in at night. And so it seems like a contradiction to me that she would have that kind of seemingly pessimistic or negative outlook for such a woman of faith. But I think we all kind of fall into that trap at different times in our lives. Life hits us sometimes, and it's really hard to be positive about our circumstance or our situation. And I'm not talking about a sort of Pollyanna hopefulness, like, oh, we'll ignore the pain and suffering, we'll just put on a brave face and everything will be fine. But there's deep meaning even in all of our experiences, whether they're happy, just as John was talking about with the tree that was so rooted in that experience of sadness, but also there was some relationship between that capacity for sadness and the capacity for that happiness that was modeled in the tree branches and the growth and the fruit and the life that came from that. So I'm not saying that we're, as a people of faith, we never have bad days or we never feel negative. But I think as a people of faith, you could call us, sometimes we refer to ourselves as a resurrection people. We kind of have a different end to the story. And that's what gives us hope in our daily lives, despite the circumstances that we might meet. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, each of you sitting here have had horrendous experiences in your life that even have tested your faith and your ability to see hope even in those moments. And so I acknowledge that, and I feel that. Proverbs chapter 17 says, "A cheerful heart is a good medicine, but a downcast spirit dries up the bones." My grandmother's bones might have been dry, but she sure lived long. So I question, we've all known people in our lives that are kind of like that. They tend to be those little black clouds. And that constant negative or critical spirit is not the spirit of a healthy faith, really. And unfortunately, sometimes when John and we've been talking about this business of good religion versus bad religion, we were talking this morning and saying, well, it's not really good versus bad. It's maybe healthy versus unhealthy. There's a difference, and there's a whole spectrum that each of us experience. But I like to think a good religion, or a healthier expression of our religion, is not one that is negative and of a critical spirit. That's what Jesus was speaking about to the Pharisees when they were criticizing him for healing a person on the Sabbath. You have a problem with me giving someone new life, healing, health? Just because it's Sabbath? How is that in any way contradictory to God's will for us to have a good and abundant life? And sometimes as a church, as an institution, we've become known as being negative. We've become very good at pointing out things that are wrong in other people or ourselves, and we're not always lifting up the good and the hopeful side. So sometimes that negative or critical spirit can really harm ourselves and people around us, and how people perceive the church. We get known for that, so we don't want to be known for that. A heart of faith really is about love and hope and joy and peace and a sense of gratitude and wonder. And so the answer, we feel, is to negativity really is to have a hopeful spirit, rather than a negative and critical spirit is to have a hopeful spirit. And so I was reading, just light back patio deck in the sunshine, reading Viktor Frankl's Search for Meaning. Has anyone read that? And if there was ever a people, Viktor Frankl was 3 years in a concentration camp during the Second World War in Auschwitz, Dachau, moved around to a few others in between. 3 years he survived in those camps. And he reflects on hope, if you can imagine. It seems hard for us to imagine to be in that kind of a situation. But he asks the question, do we focus on the good or the bad in our lives? We can all have those difficult circumstances, but what do we focus on? And he wrote these words: "We who lived in concentration camps can remember men who walked through the hut, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few and far between, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from man but one thing, the last of the human freedom, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." So he recognized that in the deprivation that they experienced within those concentration camps, that when they had so little, to hear his descriptions of how they were treated, and just shred and shred and shred of humanity that was stripped from them piece by piece. But he said those that were able to hold on to that one sense that they had a choice of how to respond to their circumstances, that somehow maintained their sense of self, their humanity, and their sense of the divine, their true self within, and how powerful that was, and how he witnessed that in some of his fellow prisoners throughout his time there. So he would say that one of the critical things to remember in terms of focusing on hope rather than negativity would be to think in terms of, in all circumstances, being able to, in some way or another, see the good in a situation. So the fact that even in that kind of horrific living circumstance, for that period of time, he could still manage to see some good. And so I think that's a challenge for us. Even, we're having a bad day because we can't find the matched socks in our drawer. We got caught at that red light once again. Gosh darn it, we're out of milk for our coffee in the morning, or heaven forbid, out of coffee, or the lineup's long at Starbucks or Tim Hortons drive-through. We can kind of put our life in perspective, can't we? And perhaps see the good in all of our circumstances and realize how blessed we truly are. I think a second thing that I'd like to highlight that helps us to move from a spirit of negativity to one more of hope is to give thanks in all circumstances. Those are the words of Paul. Gratitude is such a powerful and life-giving and healing practice. If we could find things to be grateful for in each day of our lives. I was thinking that sometimes we we're just too preoccupied to think about the good things or to be expressing our gratitude for things, but how important that is. And I realize this is a place of confession. I realize for some time now, our family, we used to always say grace around a meal. And I think somewhere along the road when people were jumping up from the table to head to hockey practice or people weren't around for whatever reason, we lost that sense of being around the table together all the time. And so that practice of grace sort of disappeared. And I've been really pondering that for a while because I realize, surprisingly, more frequently as a family, we're gathering around the table together again. And I thought, are my kids going to think I'm really weird if I start saying, let's do grace? And I think, yeah, I think I could live with that. They think I'm weird anyway, so why don't I just do that? But I just thought, just the simple fact of offering grace before a meal. And it doesn't even have to relate to the food, but it's that pause in your day to acknowledge gratitude for what has been in it or what might be coming in it if it's in the morning time. But just to have that practice of expressing gratitude and knowing we have so much to be grateful for and thankful for. And again, different circumstances, people, just to be able to find that gratitude. I remember, I think I may have told this story before because it was just so vivid in my mind, but when Amanda and I were on the Camino together, and we were into like day 3 or 4, so we were in a lot of pain. A lot of pain. Not a lot of blisters, but a nasty blister that was just constantly throbbing, and you could just barely take another step. And so we finally finished our day's walk, and we got into this, the albergue that we were staying in, and we had a bag forwarded from the last village we had stayed overnight. And so normally they would just park it in the front lobby by the front desk, and then usually if we got a private room, we had to go upstairs to get to the private room. So yes, hooray, we have a private room just for the 2 of us, but oh heavens, we have to go upstairs. And we just would look at those steps, and they looked like 110,000. And this one day we arrived at this place, and we thought, first of all, I was thinking, here's negative thinking, oh no, they lost our bag because it wasn't in the front lobby. And then they said, oh no, we took it up to your room. You what? You carried it up to our room for us? Thank you. When you're in pain and you're tired and you don't know if you have an ounce of strength to take another step, the smallest gesture means so much, and you're so grateful. Sometimes we forget, like when our days are full, don't we forget to be thankful? When everything's going great, we don't think to give thanks, but on those moments when we're just overwhelmed, we feel deep gratitude. So that's another way in which we can kind of work away from that spirit of negativity and move toward a sense of hope. The other thing that Viktor Frankl talked about in his book was the importance of having a sense of hope in their dire circumstances. He recalled that there was one Christmas in 1945 when there was an unusual number of deaths at the camp just following Christmas. Now that might not seem surprising under the circumstances, and knowing that many people had been there for so long, like who was able to hang on much longer. But he said what he realized, it wasn't that people were sicker or that there was less food than there had been or that there was more labor required of them than that had been. None of those things had changed. He said that what had changed was people approaching Christmas had hoped that they might be home by Christmas. And when Christmas came and went and they hadn't been released yet, they lost hope. And they died of despair. They lost any sense of hope. They had hung on to that one idea or thought that they might be home for Christmas, and it didn't happen. And they couldn't live with that despair. So he recognized there's such importance of having a hope and a sense of a vision for your future. We are not in a concentration camp, but there are different kinds of deaths within our lives that we experience each day. Maybe the death of a marriage or a relationship, the death of a job or a position at work, the physical death of a loved one or an illness. There are many ways in which death is a part of our lives, but the importance in experiencing or living through that death, that we often hear these words only at a funeral, but death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? We are an Easter people. We tell our resurrection stories of life after death. And it is in that spirit of hope that we can face those kinds of days and that kind of suffering that comes to us at different times. We have that capacity to experience both great joy and hope, even in the midst of that suffering and pain, because we know it does not have the last word in our lives. I thought there was an interesting few words that were written that, again, Viktor Frankl talked about in terms of this positive future, and he was reflecting on those number of inmates that had died just before Christmas, and he said, how do you respond to the question, because he was the doctor of psychiatry, that's the interesting thing about his experience, that he was both an inmate, a prisoner, but also he had his classical training behind him in psychiatry and psychology, and so he kind of tried to look at his circumstance as a researcher and understand how people were going through the experience. And he wrote, how do you respond to the question, what do I have to live for? I have nothing to expect from life anymore. I don't know if any of you have been in that kind of a conversation, perhaps with a loved one or a dear friend who's facing such untold suffering or anguish that they really don't know where to turn next. And Viktor Frankl reflected on that question, and he said, how do you respond to that? He said, what was really needed, he said, was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. We had to learn ourselves and teach one another that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. It's a little reminiscent of John F. Kennedy's words, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And I thought those are very profound words. It didn't really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. I think so many times now our millennials are highly criticized as being this sort of entitled generation. They expect so much from life and from people around them that they don't suffer well. If they can't get their favorite designer shoes at a discounted price at Winners, somehow they think it's a bad day. But it's that sense of entitlement. And I'm making a sweeping statement there. That's not all of our millennials. Many are struggling with the meaning of their lives. But we live in this consumeristic society, materialism and all those things, those signs supposedly of success. And when our young people don't get those or can't achieve them, all of a sudden their sense of their life and their meaning somehow gets diminished. And there's so much for them to learn about what really is about not what the world gives to them, but what do they have to offer. And Viktor Frankl talked about two inmates in particular, one whose wife he thought was still alive, who he loved dearly and missed terribly, and another who had been a professor like Viktor and had had some sort of manuscript or something that he had written, but it wasn't completed. And so Viktor remembers talking to them and saying, you have to live not for your own sake, but for the sake of your wife, who loves you and who will be waiting for you, and for your child who has been rescued and is elsewhere. You want to live so that that child will have a father. And then in the other gentleman's case, it was, you have to live so that you can complete that work that you'd spent so many years studying and researching. No one else can complete that work but you. So to acknowledge that we each have our own unique gifts and abilities and things that we have to offer and how important that is. So that's a kind of a hope for the future, an expectation of what we can offer the world. And I think as a church, as I began, we live in a sense of everybody thinking negatively about the church. But I think if we find ways to lift up our stories of resurrection and hope, that somehow we can be known more for that hopeful spirit rather than that negative and critical spirit. And I think each of us have our own ways of doing that in our daily lives. So let's move from negativity to hope, and let's share some resurrection stories, and let's remember that we can see the good in any situation and how important it is for us to have a sense of a future and a hope in Christ's name. We are an Easter people. That's kind of our thing. So let's do it. Amen.